Hey, what's going on there, guys? Jack here from Integrity, and in this class we'll be converting this full video of this lady prepping these flowers in a vase into this rather stylish, eye-catching cinematograph where it kind of looks like these flowers are moving in a breeze. Okay, so first port of call is to get access to the projection system, of course, and we can do so by just double-clicking on this Photomotion X folder to gain access to it, and then just navigate over to the Photomotion Glacier folder. From there, it's as simple as just double-clicking on the Photomotion Glacier project file, and of course, just waiting for After Effects to load. Now, depending on your setup, this might take a moment, but when it loads, you'll be greeted with this splash screen here. Photomotion is, of course, a viewport-based application, of course, so no need for any plugins or whatnot from there, just the project files within that Photomotion X folder. The next step is just to double-click on this Start Glacier, which will, of course, bring us into the main dashboard screen here. From there, we'll just need to double-click on this Add Video, and then when we're inside this composition, we'll just double-click on this other Add Video button, and when we hit this blank screen when we're in this composition, we know that we're in the right place. Cool, so the next step, we're just going to need to bring in our video and trim it to the duration of what we want looped. Okay, so let's just go to the desktop here and then bring in that video. From there, we'll just need to drag and drop it from our project panel into our composition. Unlike other projections, there's no need to parent this to a settings layer here. We're home free to make any adjustments just on the base video layer. So let's just adjust the scaling here a little bit more to our composition by just hitting S on the keyboard and bringing down the scale attributes here ever so slightly just to make it a little bit more smaller. We'll of course be cropping this in a portrait aspect ratio, so we don't need to shrink this perfectly into size. Then of course we'll go to the viewport and with the selection tool selected, click on the video and drag it down. If you do this whilst holding shift, by the way, that will lock you into moving it along only one axis, which is just a handy way of moving stuff in a specific direction. You can also do this by just hitting P on the keyboard and then bring up the second set of values here, which controls the y-axis, which will just drag the video down effectively. And there we go, that's our framing more or less sorted. Next step, selecting our looping footage. As you can see in our final animation, the flowers here are just kind of flowing here, which adds this really nice surreal effect. It almost looks like her hands are hovering here and there's like a gentle breeze within the room, which is quite nice. So with our time head, let's just search for that area where the flowers are in the vase, but moving ever so slightly. Doesn't matter about the lady here, as we'll be applying a freeze to the rest of this image later on. We're just looking for that flowers movement. Okay, so this is around the section that we want, so let's just cut here and then bring our section back to the very beginning of the composition. And of course, if you do this whilst holding shift, that will snap the beginning of the cut to the very beginning of the composition when it gets close. Next, we'll just delete this larger layer here, as that's basically spare footage and we don't really need it. And then of course we're just going to play around with how much of this layer that we actually want. In this section we're just going to focus on the flowers here and what exactly they are doing. You can see here that they're moving ever so slightly within that cut, which is something that we can use. Let's see of how much of that we have before the next bit of action occurs. Okay, so eventually she does move the vase, so we'll need our end cut to occur before this point. So let's just scan around here for an adequate place. Right, so 50 frames in sounds like a great place for us, just as she places her hands on the vase to move it. Let's just mark the end of our working area and preview what that would look like. Again, only focus on the flowers here, as that's the only movement that matters at this point. The rest of this video will be frozen in place at a later point, so we can just ignore all of that. Alright, that seems like a good amount. We'll just drag the end of this clip back to the very end of the workspace. Again, you can snap it to that point by holding shift here whilst doing so. Okay, so that's our work done within this composition. Let's just go to one composition above, that one that we accessed in order to get into this one. Right, so this is the part where we're going to be deciding which frame the rest of the image should be frozen on, whilst of course the flowers move. Okay, so the trick here within this example would be to find a frame that highlights highlights the animation, and of course changes the viewer's expectation. If she's holding the vase or flowers here, the movement might seem expected, as you would expect those flowers to sort of jostle about. So we'll need to find a frame where both her hands are off the vase, so these flowers look like they're being moved with no hands. This frame here, 27, is pretty good, so let's just move this freeze time marker here to that position. Again, you can hold shift to snap it into the playhead's location when it gets close to that point. By the way, when our playhead and this marker align, the viewport will have this green border around it, which of course means that this is all appropriately lined up. And that's basically this part of the animation set up. Now, back to the main dashboard for the next bit of animation setup. What we need to do next is apply a mask to this freeze frame so that we see movement where we'd want to. The way to do that, of course, is just to double click on this button Set Mask, which will bring us into this composition. Now, since we're not bringing in a mask from somewhere else, we'll just double click on this Draw Mask button too. In this composition, you'll see that it's fairly plain. No buttons or features, and that's just because in here, we're just going to be making our mask and there's nothing else that's needed. So let's just click on the layer over here, then navigate up to the toolbar and select the pen tool over here. And what we want to do is start masking out these flowers. Now we'll create a couple of points here, but the thing is we want to ensure that throughout this entire duration of this clip, our mask doesn't intersect with either a hand nor the hair. So what we'll do with the playhead is scan around for a point where a hand is closest to the flowers here, and then go back to the viewport and mask around the flowers. This, again, is just to ensure that we don't have this mask intersecting at all with our hands, and when we're done, we should have this sort of bubble mask here. The next step is to ensure that we add some feathering, as without it, this might look a little bit funky with visible lines. So with the layer selected, let's hit F on the keyboard and bring up feathering to a large amount. So if you plan to have things with movement in your cinemagraph that are attached to rigid structures like stems, increase the feathering just to be on the safe side. Okay, so with that done, let's just get back to the main dashboard and preview the animation. Looking good so far. You can see a lot of crossfading though, so let's just get to fixing that now. First, coming straight from those mask adjustments, we'll want to swap out the pen tool for the selection tool. The next step is just clicking on the animation button over here and then navigate over to effect controls. Now we could bring this loop length slider down to something like 3, which might do the trick. Alternatively, what we can do is click on this boomerang checkbox down here, which will reverse out the movement. So instead of fading from one loop of that video to the next, it will play the movement and then reverse it continuously throughout this example, just like so. Now, it's a little bit slow here, not very eye-catching, and you can kind of see the cut if you look very closely. So let's just increase the boomerang speed over in effect controls to further emphasize this movement. There we go, you can now see that when we preview it, this looks a lot more in tune of what we'd expect to see if those flowers were being moved by like a breeze or something. Pretty good so far, but there is this small imperfection that gives the game away if you look really closely. Now, next to her hair here, we can see that there is this residue from this plant. We'll just preview and then zoom into the dashboard to better show you. It's very subtle here, but if we were to export this out, it would become quite noticeable, which of course we really don't want. So, where is this coming from? Well, this problem is because the feathering of the mask that we created earlier, and this faint selection is slightly intersecting with that feather. In other words, the areas that were frozen. So let's just fix that now. Right, so of course the first step is to go back to that add mask composition where we added the mask. Again, what we're going to need to do is just select this layer here and then go up to the pen tool and finally create a second mask over here on top of this area of the flowers. What we want to do is ensure that this area is fully covered by what we'd like to see moving. When finished, we'll go back to that layer, hit F on the keyboard to bring up, of course, all the feathering, and then bring it up to something like 31 pixels. Nothing too much, of course. Right, so let's just go back to the main dashboard and preview the animation. Looking really good so far, although let's just magnify into that area and check that there aren't any distortions that might be left in there after fixing that problem. Okay, so there is one really small detail here which we can see within the animation. You have to look very carefully, but when you examine her hair here, you can see that there's a slight wavy distortion where that second or initial mask is too wide and now is including the very edges of her hair here. And of course, we want that hair to stay perfectly still within the animation. Right, so let's get to fixing that by, again, jumping into that mask layer here, ensuring that the draw mask on this layer is selected, and of course we have the pen tool still in play. So we're just going to create one quick mask of her hair this time, just around the areas which are a little bit too close to our mask. This doesn't matter too much if it intersects with our original mask a tiny weeny bit, so don't worry about that too much. Next, after creating this mask, we'll go down to this mask 3 here, in other words the mask that we just created, and then click on this add to reveal this drop down. Now as it is currently, with every mask that we create, it will actually unfreeze elements from the video. So as we've done with those flowers, we created a mask around it, and then that's unfrozen these flowers' movements within the video. And of course the reason why we're seeing the hair move is because of the feathering. So this mask here, as it is currently, will actually unfreeze the entire bit of her hair here, which of course we don't want. But we can actually get this mask to do the very opposite. So what we'll do instead is just select subtract, which will, instead of unfreezing this, it will lock it down, so it will ensure that this part here is completely frozen. Now when that's done, we'll make this a little bit more subtle by hitting F on the keyboard and then ramping up the feather so we don't end up with any hard edges or distortions with our main animation. This will ensure that now this hair is not moving within that cinemagraph, and that we have the added benefit of still maintaining a nice smooth mask. Right, so let's just get back to the main dashboard and see if we spot anything else. Frustratingly, again, we can see that very faint outline of the original problem that we had at the very beginning. So we're just seeing a little bit of residue of this flower here. So let's just go back to the mask composition one last time. And this time, all we're going to do is just bring the mask back slightly away from that plant and bring down the feathering for that hair mask too, which should fix the problem. Now this does require a little bit of tweaking if you're seeing something like this, so don't try and rush it, take your time, and of course focus on getting it right. Finally, let's just shake off this pen tool and switch it out for the selection tool. Okay, well that's our animation fixed up. Let's get to applying some finishing touches. First, let's add in some particles, and we can do that by just selecting this settings button over here under the blue particles tab and then navigating over to effect controls. By default, we'll have these petals, which of course aren't suitable in this animation, so let's swap them out for something more palatable. These dandelion seeds don't look too bad, although they're a little bit overbearing, so let's get to fixing that. First, what we'll do is we'll just bring up the shadows to the highlights via the curves over here, which will make them all bright white. Next, we'll change this channel to alpha, and then bring down the highlights, which will bring down the overall transparency of these dandelion seeds. Now, as it stands, the screen is a bit clustered as we haven't applied any aspect ratio changes, so we're seeing a lot of these particles to the sides here in this blank space area. So of course we'll need to crop this by portrait aspect ratio to remove them. To do this, we'll just click on the resolution button over here to the top right of the dashboard, and then we'll navigate over to effect controls over here and change this aspect ratio from default to portrait. As you can see now, all of these particles are cut off at the end of the frame now, and if we were to render, we'd only end up seeing this video in the center of the frame. Okay, next step, let's get to removing some of these particles, as even without the others on the edges, it's just still way too many. We'll first click on the middle button over here and then go over to effect controls and change the density here to something like 2, and then we'll do the same with the farther and distant layers too. By doing so, we'll lower down the number of particles within those layers and bring down the overall population of them within that scene without completely disabling them either. And of course, once that's done, the only other thing that we might want to do is just bring the alpha highlights just up ever so slightly, just to make them a little bit more prominent within the scene. Just a very small amount, of course, no need to go too far. Okay, and that's our particles sorted out, and with that, we're probably ready to render. Before we render, we're just going to need to change the export resolution. Again, to do so, let's just click on the resolution button again on the dashboard and then navigate over to effect controls here. We'll next change this full HD drop down to Ultra HD 4K here, which will change our export resolution, of course, to 4K. Next, let's just double click on this export button just below to bring us into the export composition. Immediately, you'll see a series of numbers below. This, of course, is the Photomotion Perfect Cut system. So we'll want something like 4 loops for this boomerang animation. So that would be, in this example, probably around about 305 frames as Photomotion Perfect Cut tells us. Let's just go over to the frame count indicator here and type that out. By the way, if you don't see this and instead see timecode, just hold Control and then click on the timecode to change over to frame count. And of course that works vice versa too. Cool, so when our playhead moves, you'll now see that Photomotion gives us a green tick for 4 loops within our animation. Before doing anything else, let's just mark the end of our work path here with our playhead on that 305 frame point, as without doing so we'll end up bringing the whole entire composition into the After Effects render engine, which is not something of course that we want. Before rendering, let's just add some final vignetting here by just going over to the settings button over here, clicking on it, then going to effect controls, and then under this vignetting option we'll just bring it up to something like 32ish, and if we check out the viewport we can see that it just adds an extra layer to focus our viewer's attention onto the flowers here. Okay, so now let's just get to rendering. First, what we'll want to do is go up here to composition and then hit this add to render queue, which will bring our working area into the After Effects render engine. Next, we'll just click on this lossless down here to bring up this output settings, as by default here, After Effects will attempt to render out an AVI, which is a tad bit overkill within these circumstances. We'll just change this, of course, to QuickTime and then hit OK. Just make sure that before hitting render, check the output location, of course, and finally just hit render over here when you're happy with it all. Now, probably we'll want an MP4 instead of a .mov to upload to something like social media sites, like Instagram for example. How we're going to do so is just by booting up Media Encoder and then bringing this render from After Effects into Media Encoder. We'll just ensure that this format here is at H.264, MP4 in other words, and of course the output location is to our liking. From there, of course, we're just ready to render, and of course, there we go. That's our animation completely concluded, and we have this really stylish animation of these flowers in a vase, kind of waving around in a draft within a room. Don't forget, if you're interested, we have plenty of other classes on different projections, so if you're interested, do feel free to check those out.